And I've given you this source in one of the resources. It points out that the largest Jewish populations of the pre-World War II era were actually living in Eastern Europe. And I showed this on the map earlier. It's Poland, the Soviet Union, Russia, Hungary, Romania, where most Jews live. Now, the Jews in those areas often lived in rural areas where they spoke Yiddish, quite a separate language from the major populations. It's a mix of German and the Hebrew. They had their own culture. They lived very separate lives from the mainstream. Whereas the Western Jews, and many of the photographs in this image here are of Western Jews, the Jews of Western Europe, the Jews of Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on, made up quite a small amount of the population. They were very much assimilated, similar to the non-Jewish populations of their country. Very few Western Jews spoke Yiddish, for example. Their cultural practices had blended into the mainstream non-Jewish society where they were. And some of these are quite beautiful photographs of Jews of Western Europe. And I particularly like our little girl here on her first day of school, where her school supplies, her pencils and so on for the first day of school, were wrapped in a cone type shape. I'm thinking like an ice cream cone is the best way to describe it, made of cardboard. And it was all stacked, and you can see the absolute delight on her face. Unfortunately, that little girl perished during the Holocaust, was murdered during the Holocaust. Most of the people you're seeing in these photographs were rounded up by the Nazis and their supporters during the Holocaust and murdered. And so it's quite a sad little footnote to some of those images. We're going to take some time now to speak through the video, the resource I have put into your OneNote for you. So can you now open up at the resource which is part of 3.1 in your OneNote content library. So in 3.1, in the content library of your OneNote, I've tried to give you an overview of the different types of Jews and where they live in Europe. And I've tried to color code it. The colors on these columns down below of the different countries relate to the colors on the map I've provided for you. And it's the map you saw at the start of this. I'd like you to imagine with the OneNote, it opens out and you can explore each of the different groups and get a very clear sense of who the victims of the Holocaust were. I've got initially on the left-hand side information about the assimilated Western European Jews. They are highly acculturated. These are a group of people who fitted into their home or their non-Jewish culture quite well. They were very difficult to spot within Jewish society. And in fact, in Germany, they fitted in and behaved very much like everybody else. Why then were the Nazis opposed to them? We've got some ideas here that the Jews in Germany represented modernity. They represented the modern world to a group, the Nazis, who idealized a pre-industrial, pre-urban Germany that was centered in country areas, centered in the traditions of the past, almost a barbarian image. France had quite a lot of anti-Semitism. There had been debates since the French Revolution as to whether the Jews were actually truly French or not. But by the 1930s, the very small number of Jewish people living in France fitted in quite nicely with mainstream non-Jewish French society. It's the Eastern Jews that we need to have our head around because they make the vast majority of the victims, or make up the vast majority of the victims of the Holocaust. And I'd encourage you to really pick through these sections and make some notes in with your stylus in your own area there, in your own notes there. The main difference with the Eastern European Jews, or from the Eastern European Jews, from the Western European Jews, between the different groups, comes down to that the Eastern European Jews are in much greater numbers. They hadn't acculturated. They had very separate cultural practices on the whole from their non-Jewish neighbours. They spoke Yiddish. The experiences of the Eastern European Jews are essentially the story of the Holocaust. So when we're talking about what happens in death camps and so on, it's an Eastern European story overwhelmingly, even though Western European Jews are there. The Jewish population of Poland is well worth noting in this resource. Just make it a little bit larger, just to get your head around how big that is. Most European Jews of the Holocaust lived in Eastern European nations. For example, the largest number of Jews in Western Europe during the 1930s lived in France, and that was about 300,000. In Poland, the population of Jews was 3.3 million. And every other Eastern European country had a Jewish population in excess of 1 million each. Warsaw, the capital city of Poland alone, had more Jews living in it than all of France. Now, there is some question mark about the exact numbers here, but it's as accurate as most scholars can make it. To add to this Eastern European story, just about all of the Nazi death camps, not just about, in fact, all of the Nazi death camps, extermination camps, are in the East. And the highest percentage of Holocaust victims was in the East. When we have a look at the remaining information here, I'd encourage you to look through the different types of Jewish people. This is giving a sense of the victims, and take particular note of Hungary. The Hungarian Jews were different again from the Russians and the Poles. So we've got an Eastern and Western Jewish story, okay, where Jews are quite different in those two areas. We've got the Holocaust story being overwhelmingly an Eastern Jewish conversation, where the vast majority of the victims, the vast majority of the murders happen in the East. And then we've got the sub-story of the Hungarian Jews, who are quite different again, and their experience is well worth noting. So I'd encourage you to look at resource, or the resource on 3.1, to get your head around exactly what the Jewish people were, or who the Jews were in Europe before the Holocaust.